Who will govern Gaza?
They can't go back to the status quo with Hamas being in a position in terms of its governance of Gaza to repeat what it did. At the same time, what I've heard from the Israelis is absolutely no intent, no desire to be running Gaza themselves.
The president says no ceasefire until the hostages are released.
Nurturing our partnerships and relationships with our allies is critically important, especially in these tumultuous times.
Just a few weeks ago, the Prime Minister's visit to Washington this week would almost certainly have been being assessed through the prism of the ongoing tensions between the United States and China and the questions they raise for Australia.
Like the stars above us, the Australia-US alliance was born in darkness.
But the complexities of the Middle East have intervened, as has a breakdown in US political norms.
The issues of the election of a Speaker, I'll leave to the members of Congress.
That's not to say that the significant announcements Anthony Albanese has been making during his visit can ultimately all be linked back to concerns about China. There's been a $5 billion cyber shield deal with Microsoft.
Hyperscale cloud computing and AI infrastructure over the next 2 years.
And this morning, a doubling to $4 billion of the government's financing facility to develop critical minerals processing in Australia. For the domestic audience, these announcements are about job opportunities and investment. Technically, they are about cybersecurity capacity, industry development and the transition to clean energy. But they really need to be seen as part of the push to reduce dependence on China for both rare earths and to shore up US access to them.
Sustainable, reliable and transparent critical minerals supply chains with the United States. There's a link between economic resilience and cooperation and our national security objectives as well.
These developments are all part of the broader AUKUS defence agenda, which has Australian access to US nuclear-powered submarines at its pointy end. The submarine part of the deal is not without its problems. Legislation in the US is stalled by the problems in the Congress, though Australian officials note an offer of a further US $3 billion towards American submarine construction may be helping.
I'm very confident of a very positive outcome, and that comes from the top in President Biden's commitment to this, but it also comes from the engagement with Congress and senators.
But for both the US and Australia, the alarming and shocking escalation of violence in the Middle East is very much occupying front of mind. This morning, Acting Prime Minister Richard Marles announced 2 more defence aircraft and troops would be deployed in the Middle East.
We want to make sure that we're prepared if matters do get worse.
It's making a clear signal to the Australian community that it is prepared to act on behalf of Australians in very dire circumstances. We can all see that the potential for really massive conflict in the Middle East is growing, and the government is making prudent steps. I think it's also making a signal to the United States. It's indicating to the Americans that, like them, we can make some prudent preparatory measures.
The conflict that we see between Israel and Hamas is, or appears to be, in its early stages.
The deployment reflects concerns that the conflict may escalate to engulf the wider region, particularly Lebanon, putting more Australians in harm's way. Even as the risk to Israeli hostages and international calls for restraint seem to have, so far, stopped any large-scale Israeli invasion of Gaza.
There are a lot of Israeli settlers on the West Bank. Israel cannot have those people being taken hostage, as happened on the 7th of October. So there's a whole dimension to the West Bank which everybody is hoping against hope doesn't occur, because that will suck in the Hezbollah, and once that happens, Lebanon is automatically involved, really, and the involvement of Iran then becomes highly problematic. And this is why so many international statesmen are visiting Tel Aviv, visiting Netanyahu, making the case for restraint.
We do not have any desire or interest to open another front. But if we will be forced to, Israel is ready. We will not be surprised again.
For now, the focus is on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
Israel, in accordance to the law, is not obliged to provide the humanitarian assistance, but to allow the passage of the humanitarian aid, as we are doing for the last few days.
He said that Israel is not responsible for the displacement of 1.1 million to the south, and Israel is not responsible for killing or bombarding these guys who are displaced in the south.
We've today joined with other members of the international community in calling for pauses in conflict to enable humanitarian aid to get into civilians.
Laura Tingle joins me now. Laura, shall we start by talking about the news on the inflation figures today?
Why not, Sarah? The news on inflation today in Australia is more bad news, really. The markets had been saying that the top of the sort of acceptable quarterly outcome would be about 1.1% inflation, and it's coming at 1.2. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot to the average person, but all the underlying measures of inflation, when you take things out, all the sort of temporary measures, they're all not going the right way either. Now, the question is it a material change in the inflation outlook? I think it's worth at this point having a look at what the new Governor of the Reserve Bank, Michelle Bullock, said in her speech last night, in her first speech as Governor.
The board won't hesitate to raise the cash rate further if there's a material upward revision to the outlook for inflation. At the same time, though, the board is mindful that growth in demand and the rate of inflation have been moderating and that there are long lags in the transmission of monetary policy.
So, Sarah, the crucial words there, material change. Now, it was interesting, Treasurer Jim Chalmers today was arguing, and this is quite an unusual intervention really, he was saying, well, these figures are not a material change in the inflation outlook. The markets are begging to differ. They've already priced an interest rate increase in at next week's Reserve Bank board meeting, and, you know, are talking about the possibility of further rate rises. Now, there are some really interesting things at play here. On the one hand, Michelle Bullock has some stakes to put down, some lines to draw in the sand and all those sorts of cliches to ensure that the markets understand she is going to take a hard line on keeping inflation in check. But on the other hand, as she said in her speech last night, all the signs are that the economy is moderating, and I think if you think about this in a political context, which is not her concern, of course, but you know, we're already seeing all this anger in the electorate about the cost of living, and also a real concern that the economy is incredibly brittle. So we don't know what would happen if rates did start to go up even further, whether that would really sort of cause a major change in the trajectory of the economy. So a very interesting question for the Reserve Bank Board next Tuesday.
And of course, all happening in a very complicated time, to borrow that phrase from the American economist Adam Tooze. We're in a polycrisis. What an extraordinarily difficult time for her to be faced with this decision.
Absolutely. Of course, everybody thought that she was coming in after the worst was over, that Phil Lowe was the last person to put rates up. But we've now got these new shocks coming from what's happening in the Middle East, and it's become a wicked problem.
Laura Tingle, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah.